Hello and welcome to another edition of the China in Africa podcast. I'm Eric Olander, and as always, I'm joined by Cobus Van Staden of the South African Institute of International Affairs in Johannesburg, South Africa. A very good afternoon to you, Cobus.
Good afternoon.
Cobus, this is my favorite show of the year. Every year at the last 2 weeks in December, we dedicate ourselves to looking back in the year that we just experienced, 2017, and then also looking ahead to what we think is coming up in China-Africa relations in 2018. So we have a format that we've been doing for the past 8 years, and it seems to work, so we're going to continue with it. Cobus and I are each bringing 3 stories that we think were the top stories of 2017. We have not actually shared notes, so we don't know what the others are, each other's stories are. And then we're going to take one story for what we think is going to be important in the look ahead to 2018. So before we get started, Cobus, why don't you just give us a little bit of an overview of what you thought, kind of what were some of the big trends? Don't give away your stories, but give us a look back at 2017.
One of the big trends that I saw was that the Belt and Road initiative, it's been around for a while, but it's really around now. It's really prevalent and strong. It's one of the key themes. It was institutionalized and inscribed into the Chinese Communist Party constitution at the Congress in October, and it is now such a central part of China-Africa relations. It's difficult to actually remember a pre-Belt and Road era. So that's actually my key trend for the year.
And it's interesting you mentioned Belt and Road in part because it will touch on so many of the stories that seem unrelated, but Belt and Road is the thread that connects them. And so let's keep that in mind, actually, as we go through our 6 stories of 2017. Why don't you go ahead and start with the third most important story, number 3, for 2017?
The one that I chose, I think we tend to think of it as, the big announcements about this started in 2016, actually. But for me, the slow implementation of the Chinese ban on ivory was my number 3 story, with the workshops being shut down in China around March, and the market supposedly closing around now. Like, we're not sure exactly when it's kicking in, but it's supposed to be at the end of this year. So it was a very interesting development to see. In a way, it almost feels like the ivory question has kind of disappeared off the table. But at the same time, as we, kind of showed through the show, with some of the interviews, the story isn't over. The crisis isn't over. We've seen reports that the Chinese ivory market is moving offshore. That these mafias that are running ivory are also moving into other kind of illicit wildlife trade. So it's kind of, the story is in a way only starting, but at the same time it is kind of this massive step, this kind of Rubicon that's been crossed by the Chinese government to actually shut down the domestic market.
Well, yeah, I'll agree with you. It was actually on my considered list. I did not actually include that in my top 3, only because that was such a big story last year. But you are right to keep it on your list, in part because it is so important. There's, in my view, good news and bad news on this. The good news is, as you've talked about, we have actually crossed a Rubicon here, in that it is now permissible to talk about banning ivory. And I can tell you, being on the streets here in Shanghai, and actually throughout my travels in China, I have seen a lot more public discussion of ivory and the ban against it. It's on buses, it's on billboards, and you can tell that it is officially sanctioned by the government as something to talk about now and to promote. So youth groups are talking about it, environmental groups are now publicly talking about it, and that's significant because here in China, NGOs and their activities and what campaigns they can focus on are all tightly regulated by the government. So it's clearly been an approved subject by the government. I think, though, that leads us to the bad news. And the bad news is that we can get lazy now. Because of all the media hype, because of all these publicity campaigns, a lot of people can think, well, it's not that big of a deal anymore. And we just got a sobering reality check back in November when a multi-ton stash of ivory coming over the border from Vietnam was hauled in by Chinese customs. Now, some people said, wow, look, Chinese customs is now cracking down more effectively. That actually is a good thing, and we need to recognize that. Chinese customs also did a very, very big haul of pangolin illicit wildlife trafficking of pangolins as well. So there does seem to be, at least on the public relations side, a newfound enthusiasm on the part of Chinese customs to crack down. The downside is there still seems to be a significant demand for these types of products, for ivory and for pangolin and for a lot of these wildlife products coming from Africa. And so if we are not vigilant in keeping the attention and the awareness up, I suspect, or I worry, that we can become complacent and the sales will still go on, the killing will still go on, the buying will still go on.
And in a weird way, our bigger Belt and Road theme is strangely also locks into this. Like, I'm reading a great book by the sinologist Harry Gelber, which looks at, it's called The Dragon and the Foreign Devils, which, please everyone writing on China, leave out the dragon out of your titles in the future. But not to diss his title, but it's this great book telling it's a big sweeping history of China as told through its relationship with the outside world. It's, the different kind of Chinese encounters with the outside world across centuries. And, so I'm at the Ming Dynasty at the moment, and already during the Ming Dynasty there was rhino horn and ivory flowing from Africa into China. So, and along the same routes as the Chinese government is reawakening now through the Belt and Road initiative. So it is this, it's centuries old, this trade. Breaking it is going to be harder than I think people expect.
It will take time. Okay, my number 3 top story of 2017. I'm actually going to do, I'm cheating here a little bit. I apologize. I'm going to do a little bit of an umbrella to include 2 stories. And it's called the launch of railways. So this was a very, very important year for 2 very anticipated, highly anticipated railways that launched. One is the standard gauge railway between Nairobi and Mombasa in Kenya, and the other is the Addis Ababa-Djibouti Railway. And I think these were hugely important, in part because it was China delivering on a promise that was years in the making. These are you just can't overstate the importance of building this kind of infrastructure. Let's put aside the questions of the cost, which both railways from Ethiopia to Djibouti and the standard gauge railway in Kenya appear to have run much higher than they were budgeted to. A lot of people say that the Chinese ripped off these countries, that they could have gotten a better deal somewhere else. That may be the case, but the fact that the Chinese provided the full package of services, the financing and the implementation, plus the training, I think is significant. I think that would have been much more difficult to do had Ethiopia and Kenya gone out onto the open market, got financing from the World Bank, then got the trains from the Japanese, and then got training from the Americans. That would have been a very difficult process. So the fact that this was all bundled up together might have had a very important role in making this happen. Incidentally, back to your point, Cobus, about Belt and Road, both of these trains do have their connections to Belt and Road. Both of these trains are also on the Belt and Road lines, and I think that underlies the enthusiasm that the Chinese have for building this type of infrastructure in that part of Africa. So very quickly, just to remind everybody, the launch of the Mombasa-Nairobi standard gauge railway was at the end of May, and then the Addis Ababa-Djibouti railway, which is still undergoing testing and whatnot, that came out, let me think, that was about mid-year that came around. And then in October, they did a test run, and they're still kind of testing a lot of these different parts of that railway. That's a little bit more of a complicated railway. But that is so important for Ethiopia, in part because this is the first international connection that's been made for Ethiopia to get its direct rail line to the sea.
I 100% agree, and I agree to the extent that you'll probably see a similar kind of theme of mine coming up later in the list. But I'll discuss it in more detail when we get to it. But yeah, 100% agree. It's a massive leap forward, and it's going to really change the face of Africa, I think.
And it's one of these stories that I think people in the West wouldn't value as much. But infrastructure and the launch of high-profile, big infrastructure projects in Africa is incredibly important and undervalued in many parts of the rest of the world. So that's it. So let's move on down our list. Number 2 in your list, the second most important story of 2017, Cobus. What is on your list?
The story on its face was a minor controversy, but I think I chose it because it points to much larger issues in the China-Africa relationship, and that was the racist photo exhibit at the Chinese Museum. It was a bunch of paired pictures with Africans with different facial expressions, coupled with a picture of an animal with a similar facial expression, supposedly. In most cases, you couldn't see any resemblance at all. And it was this kind of dumb exhibition, like by it wasn't a full-on professional artist. He was he had a different job, and it was, he's a kind of a hobbyist photographer, and then he got this exhibit, and then it blew up, and it just became this social media hysteria, kind of, and rightly so, because of this incredibly loaded, juxtaposition of Africans and animals, and all of the relations drawn between them, and incredibly flat-footed reaction by the Chinese. Finally, after a few days of the internet going nuts, it was finally removed. The reason I chose it is because race, I think, is going to be a much bigger issue in the China-Africa relationship as we go forward. As the China-Africa relationship moves beyond simply extraction, as it moves into Chinese companies manufacturing stuff in Africa and selling stuff to African people, and the African economies maturing and becoming more complex and wanting to engage with with China in different kind of ways, race is this time bomb, I think. China is so behind in terms of thinking of itself as a multicultural place. It has so little kind of intellectual tools at the moment to think of itself as a racist country. At the same time, there's so much sensitivities on both sides in relation to these issues, and I think China has no idea how badly this kind of thing can go wrong in Africa. So I think this is it's a small incident, but a potentially big problem.
I'm surprised that you picked this one, and I personally don't think that it rises to the level of something anywhere near as significant as you do. So this is actually, our dear listeners, one of the first times you may hear on our show where Cobus and I vociferously disagree with one another. It doesn't happen very often, and this is one of those cases. To me, this was a podunk exhibit in a remote, it wasn't quite remote, but it was definitely a provincial town. It escapes me exactly where it was. I think it was in Wuhan. I want to say it was in Wuhan,
yes,
which is a second-tier city. I mean, this was not at the any of the major museums in Beijing or Shanghai, which was put on by a major government institution. It was not put on by a noted artist. This was a joker of a photographer who had a lot of experience in Africa. But what was significant to me about this story was how the local expatriate African community, the diaspora here, rose up in anger and not only got the government-funded museum to withdraw and close down the exhibit after I think it was like 100,000 people had already seen it, but then extracted an apology from the photographer and the group of photographers. It actually wasn't one; it was a collective of photographers. And that was remarkable. And what was so interesting is that we could watch. There was a video made of local activists, African activists, working with the different, working with the group of photographers. And what was so interesting was how it was such a struggle because they just didn't understand what the problem was. And I think that goes to your point about there still is a sense of insensitivity here about the issues of race. And in defense of China here, and gosh, I'm going to be called a panda hugger again. I'm sorry. But when you live in China, you're surrounded by mostly Han Chinese. It's a 94% Han Chinese community, particularly out here in eastern China, where it's almost 100%. The minority populations are generally in the west and in the south, so there's not a multicultural society. So you talk about how there is this lack of awareness, and that's kind of understandable a little bit. And because this isn't a multicultural society, it is not an immigrant society, where are people going to get that experience of dealing with people of other races so that they can build up the sensitivities and build up that language and that vocabulary to talk about race? It's not going to happen in Shanghai and Beijing under the current circumstances. So I don't actually know how that happens other than A, running into these kinds of problems, which may ultimately be healthy because it sparks a conversation, and B, the more Chinese people who travel overseas, who live overseas and live in the United States and Africa and multicultural communities and societies, that will help in the long run. But that's a very, very long-term ambition. So
yeah, I think the difference, I think, in terms of our perspectives is interesting, because I think it's also the difference between the perspectives of living in China and living in Africa. Because, here, if one is, one is so immersed in these issues, South Africa is obviously has its own, kind of particular supercharged version of racial issues. And, and South Africa is going through a process where there's a lot of public discussion of these issues. So, that probably informs my view. But I think also that I agree with you. The exhibit itself and the artists involved and so on, they were all minor. They were all, kind of like small-time hobbyists. The fact that it managed to blow up to, on the level that it did, completely belied how a minor exhibit it was. And it showed the process, it showed how African social media is taking off, and also how it is ready to jump on these issues in a much more aggressive and an activist kind of way.
But isn't that the point? No, but let's stop right there. Ready to jump on it. And it feels a little bit like any time there is the racist TV commercial, one of these photo exhibits, there is this, aha, gotcha. I knew it. I knew it. You guys were just these racist pigs who were coming here to kind of colonize us the same way that the whites came here to do it. Ba, 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 ba. And I think that can be deceiving in many respects, because it doesn't show how many intercultural marriages are happening, how many intercultural children are being born, how much assimilation is happening both on the African side here in China, but also among Chinese in Africa. And so those stories don't get the attention and are not jumped on anywhere with the amount of enthusiasm that these stories are. So
exactly.
I think
exactly that's exactly what I mean.
So it warps it a little bit that these kinds of things happen, and it seems to happen. 2016, we had the soap
TV
commercial.
ad. Yeah.
And then this year we had the museum exhibit. So if we're really confined to one high-profile racist outburst per year, all in all, that's actually not too bad.
That seems like a pretty optimistic kind of count.
Considering that there's almost 2 billion people here involved, that's what we're talking about.
I think this is gonna be a bigger as Africa becomes more, like, somewhat richer and somewhat more empowered. I think not only China particularly, because China is just very, very flat-footed about these issues, and they can be incredibly, clumsy about them. But I think the entire outside world has no idea of the level of hurt in Africa about these issues. And most of the time the outside world doesn't care, right? I mean, like Europe isn't worried about this for one single second. However, as Africa becomes a little bit more empowered, this stuff is going to come up a lot. Because there's a whole reservoir of this of resentment and anger about this stuff. This is over the next few decades. This is going to dominate world discourse.
That may be the case, and my final point on this before we move on is that at the same time you're saying that there will be more sensitivity in Africa to this, I suggest that there is a whole new generation of young Chinese, and I say young, they're millennials, 25 to 35, who have spent years now working in Africa as project managers for state-owned enterprises, either as migrants and whatnot. They speak the languages, they are intermarrying, they are assimilating. They are people like Huang Hongxiang, who we've had on the show, who's the activist founder of China House in Kenya. There's a whole new generation of these young Chinese who are in Africa, and they will actually pave the way in many ways. And they are going to be very, very sophisticated sophisticated on assimilation, and they're going to be very sophisticated on these racial issues, much more so than previous generations were. So I wouldn't underestimate them.
I suppose. I mean, I tend to, there definitely are people like that. But I wonder if we have the kind of critical mass that we need, of them.
We have a lot of people there. There are a lot of people, and they are opening businesses, they're in communities, and now, I'm not saying necessarily that familiarity necessarily breeds, the expression goes that it breeds contempt, which is also part of may actually occur, but it also does breed assimilation, understanding, cultural awareness, and some of the sensitivities that you're looking for. So I think keep an open mind on that, and it's not necessarily a gloomy future. Not necessarily. So there we go. That is, again, one of the first times on the show that you hear us vociferously disagree with one another. Okay. My second most important story of 2017 was the November visit of General Constantino Chiwenga from Zimbabwe 1 week before the overthrow of the Robert Mugabe government. I thought this was a really, really important milestone in not just China-Africa relations, but in where the direction of the world is going. Chiwenga easily could have canceled his trip to Beijing. This was a trip that was arranged in advance, so they tell us. It was not a specially arranged trip or hastily arranged just ahead of the coup, but it was actually coup. We can call it a coup, but it's not officially defined as a coup by...
It's still not officially defined as a coup, yeah.
By the African Union or the United States or the Chinese. No one is calling it a coup, but in reality, it was a coup. So Chiwenga certainly could have changed his plans, but he didn't. In the past, 10, 15 years ago, Chiwenga may have gone to London, he may have gone to Washington, may have gone to Brussels, even Paris, to let officials there know. He didn't. He went to Beijing. And this was really, really significant for me. This represents, in many ways, the emergence of China as a world power. And we don't know what was actually said in Beijing. We don't know, did the Chinese consent to the change in power? Did the Chinese give their blessing? Did the Chinese give intelligence support? Nobody knows anything. So anything you hear about it is speculation. But he went. That is the one fact that we do know. And I think that is incredibly important, and it represents a sea change in global international or in international relations, in my view.
Yes, I 100% agree. And in fact, not to do any log rolling, but Chris Alden and I co-wrote an op-ed for The Conversation, which made very much this point, that saying that the conversation about whether China pulled some kind of regime change trigger in Zimbabwe, we felt was the wrong conversation to have. There's no indication drawing on the history of China's conduct in Africa that they support this kind of that they would officially try and change a regime. I don't think they did it in Zimbabwe, and I don't think in other cases where their investments are in a lot more danger than they were in Zimbabwe under Mugabe, they also didn't do it. So that's I to a large extent I felt that was the wrong conversation to have, and instead we suggested that this is the actual conversation to have, that what it really reveals is that China is now a full, comprehensive world power, as Xi Jinping has been pushing it to be, and in the process that it's not only China asserting its world power status, it's now other countries reflecting it back to China.
There we go. And I think this is a key point here, is that the Zimbabwe relationship for China is meaningless in the overall scheme of things. China's international relations are far more complex and nuanced than to depend on Zimbabwe. So Zimbabwe is a footnote. But it does, as you point out, it shows the reflection of it. Ian Bremmer, who is the president of the Eurasia Group, he pointed out, he said that Xi Jinping's speech at this year's APEC summit in Vietnam, in Da Nang, was a turning point. That was the moment when China stepped up onto this world stage as a major international power. When Xi Jinping kind of announced that China will take on global responsibilities. And the reason why Ian Bremmer said it was this, and I think I agree with him on this, is that this is one of the first times that a country has emerged to global power status without a war. And that is very, very significant. And it comes at the same time, of course, as the United States' role in the world is changing. I won't necessarily say that the United States is retreating. I have used that line in the past. It's changing. Its engagement in Africa, for example, is not necessarily declining. It's just being reallocated to military. It's being refocused on security and terrorism, not as much on development and humanitarian issues and trade. But that said, there's still a lot of focus on Africa. It's just in a different way. Whereas China now is spreading itself into military, humanitarian issues, trade, all these different things that the United States and European powers used to do, but now are doing less. And so this emergence of Xi Jinping as a major world figure, this emergence of China as a global power, the second largest economy, the deployment of a blue water navy, and at the same time, other countries, particularly in Africa, reflecting that, as you pointed out. So to me, this is all part of a much bigger matrix that we have to look at. Final comments on that?
Yeah, no, you 100% agree. I would slightly differ from Ian Bremmer in the sense that, that for me was one of the moments. The other one was in Davos earlier this year where Xi Jinping also explicitly claimed globalization, as a Chinese phenomenon, essentially, kind of like that claimed a position for China in the center of globalization, as the US was retreating and the UK is retreating from multilateralism. But yeah, there's a successive cases of China stepping into multilateral organizations, taking on a leadership position in terms of climate change, for example, really widening its activities and its focus.
That's right. Yeah. And it comes also, again, if we were doing the end-of-year review of this year in China, we would also talk about Tencent becoming the first Chinese company worth over $500 billion, a $500 billion plus company. So you're seeing in so many ways, in so many aspects of Chinese society, them emerging now to great power status. That is something that's significant. And again, I think the visit by General Chiwenga was symbolic on that. Okay, your number one story of the year in 2017 for China-Africa relations?
My number one story is actually the launch of the railways that you mentioned as well. It's like China has built several railways. They also, within this one could include the railway expansion in Nigeria as well. And as we discussed, this is just a game changer for Africa. So seen from the African side of the China-Africa relationship, I think it's really almost impossible to overstate how significant these rail lines are, even though they're still relatively small in relation to the networks that are planned. If those networks all get built, and you have comprehensive rail networks that link several East African countries, that would essentially be a major step for Africa to overcome the 19th century, the damage of 19th century European colonialism. The way that Africa was carved up into pieces that don't fit together, that don't have any coherence cross border. This would be a major step in solving that. And for that reason, I tended to focus on it more than I think it looks, more than the significance of it on the surface. Sure, kind of having rail connections between these cities are great for the people living in these countries, but in the bigger scheme, the significance for the entire continent is really amazing. It's a massive step forward.
It can't be overstated, and it's so important. And that's why, again, I had it on my list. I didn't have it as my number one, as my number three, but I see your point entirely here. One other key thing here is that we've talked a lot about soft power over the past few years, but I really think that if you look back at the news coverage of the opening of these railways, whether it was the light rail in Addis Ababa last year, the standard gauge railways in Ethiopia, Djibouti, and Kenya, and upcoming in Nigeria, the way that the press in these different countries cover it is so excited, so positive, and I think to me this is really an extension of the soft power narrative that China is bringing to Africa, and it's one that would never occur to people in the West who define soft power more around Jay-Z and Beyonce and movies and traditional entertainment. But the building of infrastructure, getting stuff done, that ability to deliver on a promise, something that Western aid groups have struggled with, where, things go through years and years of environmental impact reviews, of, grant reviews, of legal reviews, and just so much bureaucracy. And I think one of the things that people do like about the Chinese involvement in Africa is the pragmatism that they bring, which is like, we're just going to get it done. And we saw that in the documentary that G.D. Wong and Philip Mann did a couple weeks ago in our discussion. And one of the comments from one of the Kenyans was, you know what? The Chinese, they get stuff done. And I think this is really the embodiment of that. And really, I agree with you. It is something very impressive.
And, I think also the reason I also put it at the top is that it isn't a simple good news story. I mean, a lot of it is great news, but the fact, the kind of implications, the financial implications for Africa about this, the fact that some of the deals were probably quite a lot more expensive than they could have been. It also, it raises a lot of questions about the price Africa is paying for some of this. And, it's a kind of a can't make an omelette without breaking eggs situation. It's such a big leap forward that in the process it's not a leap that you can make very neatly necessarily, and it might cause a lot of problems as it solves a lot of other problems. And I think that kind of balance, between what kind of problems you can handle and which ones you need to solve immediately, that is key questions to ask in African development. And they got one answer in this case, and then we're going to have to see whether they could have gotten a better answer. Tanzania recently made a big deal with I think a Turkish investor, where they managed to get, and which will actually be part of this network, this kind of integrated network that was planned around Chinese provision. The Tanzanians kept themselves out of the deal making with the Chinese. They made a different, much cheaper deal with a Turkish construction company. So we're going to have to see whether they made the smarter deal. And I think, but the fact that these questions are even on the table shows how far we've come.
Okay. My number one story of 2017, the August 1, 2017 opening of the first overseas military base by the Chinese in Djibouti. Again, just like the railways, the importance of this cannot be overstated. You have to go back into 50 years of Chinese foreign policy doctrine that said they will not have foreign bases. This was a benchmark policy for decades. And now, at first, they didn't call the base in Djibouti an actual base. They call it a facility, a supply station. I mean, they bent around every which way to make sure that it's not a base. I get the sense now that they're pretty much open about it, and they're saying it's a base. This was a $600 million project. It formally opened on August 1st, as I mentioned. They've had their first live fire exercises just about 2 months later on September 22nd, and that was really fascinating because the way not only did they have these live fire exercises, but they had the videos and the drones to shoot it. And it was really quite dramatic. So it was hard to tell if they were making a PR video or they're actually doing military exercises. Now, the base has been misinterpreted by a lot of people as being part of this grand kind of takeover of Africa. And if you looked at the American right, the hysteria was it was laughable because this is a relatively small base compared to Camp Lemonnier, which is the American base that's there, the U.S. facility, and also compared to the presence of the French and some of the legacy powers in Africa. The Chinese really don't have a very big military presence in Djibouti, and I think it's very easy to overstate it. The base is a naval base really used for resupplying the multinational anti-piracy operations off the coast of Somalia and the Gulf of Aden. It is also part of the One Belt, One Road. There is no doubt that this is the first of a number of military installations that will come in the years along Belt and Road. This one is particularly important because it's at the mouth of the Suez Canal, which is going to be a very important link in Belt and Road. But to me, that was very important. I also want to make one other point about the Djibouti base. And so this is an adjunct to my number one story of the year, and I'm going to call Wolf Warrior 2. Wolf Warrior 2, if you remember, is the hugely successful action movie. Box office tickets now are about $870 million worldwide, 90-some-odd% of that, of course, in China. Wolf Warrior 2, if you don't remember, is the Chinese action film directed and starred by Wu Jing, who is now the biggest, hottest star here in China. But a billion-dollar movie is something that doesn't come along very often. Africa played a central role in the movie, but the Chinese military, particularly the People's Liberation Army Navy, played a very important role in this. And you saw those big zooming shots of the warships coming off the coast, and there was even some shots at the base. And I guess it's all tied together that they're launching this base, the propaganda, the narrative within the society is changing, that they have this ability to project power. So on the one hand, there's the real military power, and then the other part of it is the media narrative that Chinese culture is starting to rally behind in much the same way that Americans have for decades as well. So the military base, or the Navy base, and Wolf Warrior 2 are my number one stories of 2017.
Yeah, no, I 100% agree with you that they're incredibly important. The reason I didn't end up putting them on my top three is because this time I decided to make my top three very focused on the African side of the China-Africa relationship, particularly like from, you being in China, I decided that it's probably a good idea for me to take a very African view. And I think from the African side, this is certainly massive news. I mean, it certainly indicates a very, very significant kind of widening of the Chinese role in Africa, and certainly like China stepping into a global superpower role in a way that is really eye-popping. But at the same time, from an African perspective, I think it also is a kind of in a way, almost a kind of a lower key or almost muted story which is part of a wider story of the increasing militarization of foreign presence in Africa. So in a way, it dovetails well with what you mentioned about the U.S. Presence being increasingly militarized. And so it is a story for the ages. It's really, really kind of epoch-making story, like news event. But from the African perspective, I felt that in a way it is more an adding to rather than a completely new chapter.
Okay, fair enough. I think it does give an interesting contrast in how we're approaching it, because this year in 2017 I moved to China. I moved back here. I've lived here for a long time in a previous era, but now I'm back here. So I'm taking, I think, a more Chinese view of things. And the fact that you're taking a more African view is interesting, and I think makes our discussions that much more lively. Let's now look ahead to 2018. One story and one trend that you think is going to be the thing that we should all keep our eyes on in the year ahead. What is it?
This was quite under the radar, but there's a Chinese company called Transsion that outstripped Samsung in selling phones in Africa this year. They sold, in the first half of the year, 50 million smartphones in Africa. It is now the largest, it's a quite unknown company. It is now the largest smartphone provider in entire Africa, and they're just like pushing cell phones into Africa at an incredible level. So one of the things that I found very interesting is that Transsion isn't a particularly kind of large company in China. In fact, that they actually bypassed the Chinese market and focused on the global South market. Particularly in Africa, they're slowly making inroads in India as well. And so they showed that you can make money by selling stuff to Africans. And one of the really interesting things was some of the ways that they changed the specs of their phones for the African market. So they made it, in the first place, most of the phones that they're selling take more than one SIM card. Which, because Africans frequently have more than one SIM card because the networks are so gappy. So, like, especially not so much in South Africa, but in places like Nigeria, they need phones with more than one SIM card slot because they're moving from network coverage to network coverage, as they move in the city. They also, it's like, I kind of have to laugh. One of the ways that they made a lot of money in Africa is by increasing the bass in their speakers. So the music is just when you play music loud and also over headphones, they boosted the bass feedback, and then also they changed the cameras to make dark skin tones, so that you don't lose definition and with taking pictures of people with dark skin tones. So all those little tweaks means that they made a ton of money, and I think it shows. It gives a little template of how businesses, and particularly Chinese businesses, will start making money in Africa.
Just to pick up on the tech side of what you're saying, I think one other key important trend, not necessarily one I am going to be defining as my most important for 2018, but one that will definitely come up, is the emergence of China's e-commerce and internet companies that finally make it to Africa. So Jack Ma this year came to Nairobi and Rwanda. Of course, he's the founder and multi-billionaire owner of Alibaba, and Tencent, which is partially owned by Naspers in South Africa, is talking about bringing WeChat into more African markets. And WeChat may or may not actually be present in a lot of African markets, but the back end of WeChat, some of the OS of it may start to show up in banking apps and may start to show up in some of the e-commerce transactions that people don't actually know about, but they're using a lot of Tencent data and using Tencent technology. So Chinese bike sharing is starting to come to Africa. So some of the e-commerce models that have worked so well here and that are very well customized for emerging markets and developing markets, expect to see some of those start to show up in Africa as well. My theme in the most important story for 2018 is going to be, is this the year that China loses interest in Africa? Now that is kind of a shock, maybe, but there are a lot of indicators to show that China's interest in Africa is really starting to wane in a very significant way. There was a report earlier this year that immigration peaked in 2013, Chinese immigration into Africa. And since 2013, Barry Saltman, who's a professor at the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology and probably one of the best-known scholars on Chinese migration in Africa, he's talked about how there has been a net emigration of Chinese migrants out of Africa for the past 3 or 4 years. So that's one indicator. Trade is down significantly from 2015. So first half trade, which is the only numbers that we have for 2017, came in at $85 billion. So if we stretch that out to the second half and just assume that it's somewhere around that, we're going to be under $200 billion, which is down significantly from the $220 billion that we saw in 2015. 2016, the number went down, so they're talking about increases over 2016, but that's off of a low base. So it will be interesting to see our trade volumes down between China and Africa. And finally, investment. Sinopec, one of the largest oil companies in the world, says, you know what? We're getting tired of Nigeria and Gabon. An oil company getting tired of Nigeria, to me, is just remarkable. But will we see more Chinese companies and major oil firms and resource extraction companies go, you know what? We've got a lot more commitments that we have to take care of on Belt and Road. We can invest in more parts of the world now that we couldn't do 10, 15 years ago. And honestly, we don't really want to deal with the corruption, the risk, the lack of governance, the poor infrastructure, all of the problems that Africa has. So let's go somewhere else. And so all those people who worried about China colonizing Africa, taking over Africa, conquering it, becoming the new imperial overlords of Africa, I think the bigger concern might be what happens if China actually packs up and leaves in a very significant way.
I've seen a lot of this, a lot of these indicators, of course, and it's something that I keep wondering about, whether what we're seeing is a loss of interest or a shift of interest. Whether there is what we're seeing is, for example, the Sinopec story. Are we seeing a loss of interest in African oil, or are we seeing a correction for overinvestment during boom times when the oil price was particularly high? So are we seeing a retreat, or are we seeing a correction? That's what I'm wondering.
It's subject to interpretation. It's hard for us to tell. Again, Sinopec, as an extension of the Chinese government, is not a very transparent organization, so we will probably never know. I got flagged on LinkedIn by some of my followers who said that they're not linked. This is just a readjustment of Sinopec's business. I will contend that if we have a lot of different dots, there might be a way to link them together. But as you point out rightly, maybe these just are dots. And the other thing to think about is that Chinese interest in Africa is changing. It's not necessarily declining. If we just measured in pure economic and investment terms, sure, maybe it is just declining. But we're seeing an increase in commitment to humanitarian issues. Obviously, the PLA and the military is more interested in Africa than they were before. Culturally, there's more Chinese sponsorship of African students to go to study in Beijing and Shanghai and all the major cities in China. So it's maybe shifting as well and moving to a more mature phase of the relationship rather than simply China throwing out cash. Speaking of which, if I'm correct, 2018 is another summit year. Is that correct for FOCAC?
Yes.
So
there's a whole bunch of summits this coming year. It's going to be very busy.
It's going to be very interesting. So FOCAC is the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation. And if previous FOCACs tell us anything, what usually happens is that China whips out a huge check and says, we're going to give you $60 billion. Before that, it was they just keep ramping up and amping up the money that they're going to give. Is that going to be the same this year? Are they going to give $80 billion, $90 billion? Or will it be, you know what? We're not going to give you as much money, but we're going to do other things. We just want to be friends.
Yes,
so that might be an indicator.
FOCAC 2018, yes, FOCAC 2018 is going to be a real kind of litmus test of where the relationship is going.
That'll be a weather vane for us.
Because I don't think China can keep just necessarily. I mean, China has a lot of money, but it becomes, just ratcheting it up by 30 billion every 3 years, that doesn't necessarily work. It's not necessarily sustainable.
And it's really unhealthy. It is really unhealthy. It once again creates this donor-dependent relationship. And it is, to me, if that is where they keep going, I will be very, very disappointed in some ways, because you just then see one African leader, standing with hat in hand and saying, how much are you going to give me? One after another like that. And so I hope it's not going to be simply just more money.
The other option would be, for radically changing trade regimes, for example. It would be interesting, like, if they don't do it, what they follow it up with in other gestures.
Yeah. What we would like to see more of, and this is what analysts like Nsetse Were, who we've interviewed twice this year, we would like to see more market opening in China for African agricultural products, making it easier to export tea, export rice. And already China's market is relatively open, especially compared to the U.S. and Europe for agricultural products. But to do more to develop African exports into China. So making it easier for South African fruit exporters to bring their products into China as well. This is a huge market. And if there is a way to further establish this as a major destination to increase the trade and to really start to bring some attention to the trade imbalances that exist between African countries and China, which are unsustainable in the long run. And that's another kind of touch point. So before we get down the line too far, we don't want to get away from our top three stories and our one story of the year in 2018. We want to close our show, as we do every year, with a very generous thank you to all of you who have been listening. Our audience continues to grow every year, and we are just so eternally grateful. You have no idea. This is a passion project for Cobus and I. We both have day jobs, and we do this because we love it, and we do it now in major part, because we get such great feedback from all of you. On Twitter, on Facebook. Even the criticisms are really thoughtful, and I appreciate all of that. And so this is such an important part of our lives. Cobus and I have been doing this together now for 8 years, so next year will be our 8th year. And we're just super grateful. And in this holiday season, when we're all supposed to give thanks to things and to show our appreciation, I think, for me, I just want to say thank you to everybody for participating and for following and for engaging with us, and the lovely feedback that you give, the questions. Sometimes you challenge us. A lot of times I get corrected, and I really, really appreciate that too. It helps keep me honest. And no one's perfect. And so when you guys correct me, it is always something that I welcome. And you'll see that I post. Sometimes I say, my bad. Totally got that one wrong, and I really appreciate everybody kind of helping keep me honest as we go forward into a new year as well.
100%. It was, it's such an amazing community, and we so appreciate all of your support and, feedback and listening and comments. And yeah, it's very humbling, and we really, really appreciate it.
So we're going to take a couple weeks off for the holidays, and then we're coming back in 2018 with an exciting new partnership that I'll unveil here today for the first time with the Africa-China Reporting Project at Wits University and the School of Journalism there. So starting next year, we're going to have an integration and partnership with them on the podcast, as well as our weekly email newsletter, and then also some of their seminars and some of their trainings. We're going to be bringing on journalists from across Africa and hopefully from China that engage with the Africa-China Reporting Project at Wits. You'll hear a new format in the podcast with a little bit of credits that are given to them, and we're hoping at the same time to really introduce you to their community, and so that it can open up into a whole new world of how journalism is being created to tell the China-Africa story. So that's something we're really looking forward to in 2018. So we'll see you in next year with another edition of the China in Africa podcast. Thank you so much for listening.
The discussion continues online. Head over to facebook.com/China Africa Project to share your thoughts on today's show, or follow China Africa News that's updated every 4 hours, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The guys are also on Twitter, where you can find Cobus at Stadanesk or Eric at EOlander. That's EOLANDER. Subscribe to the China Africa podcast on iTunes or download the mobile apps for iOS, Android, or Windows Phone. Just head over to your favorite store and search for China Africa.